The wine spread across the sacred carpet like spilled blood. She collapsed among shards of crystal before hundreds of golden eyes, turning the holiest ceremony of the year into her deepest humiliation. What she did not know was that the most powerful alpha had traveled there for the sole purpose of meeting her. The crimson wine spread across the sacred carpet like spilled blood, seeping into threads that had witnessed centuries of ceremonies, while Evelyn's torn dress clung to her trembling frame as hundreds of golden eyes stared down at her in absolute silence. The humiliation burned deeper than any physical wound, scorching through her chest as she knelt among the shards of crystal that moments before had held the ceremonial wine meant to bless the chosen Luna. Her cheeks flamed with shame, so intense it felt like fever, and she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, drowning out everything except the devastating realization that she had just ruined the most sacred moment in her pack's yearly cycle. 26 years of carefully avoiding the spotlight, 26 years of purposefully blending into the background, and now she had become the center of attention in the most catastrophic way possible. The borrowed dress, already too large for her slight frame, had caught on the ancient stone steps as she climbed toward the presentation platform, sending her tumbling forward in a cascade of pale blue silk and mortification. The goblet had flown from her startled grasp, its contents arcing through the air in what seemed like slow motion, before splashing across the ceremonial carpet that had never, in 300 years of tradition, been stained by anything other than blessed oils and flower petals. Evelyn's hands shook as she tried to gather the torn fabric around herself, acutely aware that every werewolf in the Great Hall was witnessing her disgrace. The silence stretched endlessly, broken only by the soft drip of wine from her soaked hair onto the marble floor below. She could smell the mixture of embarrassment and pity radiating from the crowd, a scent that made her stomach churn with additional shame. This was supposed to be the night when unmated females presented themselves with dignity and grace, hoping to catch the eye of their Alpha Supreme. And instead, she had turned it into a spectacle of clumsiness and destruction. The worst part was knowing that she didn't even belong here. As a lowly archivist in the PAC's Historical Records Department, she had no business participating in the lunar selection ceremony. Her invitation had come as a surprise, delivered by a stone-faced messenger who had seemed as confused as she felt. For weeks, she had tried to decline respectfully, knowing that her presence would be an anomaly among the daughters of beta families and accomplished she-wolves who traditionally competed for the honor. But PAC law was clear. All unmated females of age must present themselves when summoned, regardless of rank or expectation. Now, as laughter began to ripple through the crowd in barely suppressed waves, Evelyn understood why she had dreaded this moment. She was not like the others, had never been like the others. While they had spent years perfecting the art of social grace and political maneuvering, she had buried herself in dusty tomes and forgotten histories. While they had trained in the subtle dance of pack politics, she had memorized genealogies and ancient laws that most wolves had forgotten existed. She was useful in the archives, invisible in her corner of the library, but here, under the blazing chandeliers and penetrating stares of hundreds of her packmates, she was nothing but a mistake waiting to happen. The magnificent Alpha Supreme stood at the head of the hall on his raised platform, and even from her position on the floor, Evelyn could feel the weight of his gaze. Darius Blackthorn commanded attention simply by existing, his presence so commanding that the air itself seemed to bend around him. She had seen him only from a distance during pack meetings and formal announcements, always surrounded by his council of advisors and the daughters of important families who vied for his notice. He was everything an alpha should be: tall, powerful, intimidatingly handsome, with eyes like molten gold that could strip away pretense with a single glance. Those golden eyes were fixed on her now, and Evelyn wished desperately that the marble floor would crack open and swallow her whole. She could imagine what he must be thinking, how her pathetic display must appear to someone who had never shown weakness, never stumbled, never failed so publicly and dramatically. The Alpha Supreme was known for his decisive leadership and unwavering strength, qualities that had guided their pack through territorial disputes and political challenges that had destroyed lesser communities. What must he think of a clumsy archivist who couldn't even walk upstairs without causing destruction? The silence was becoming unbearable, stretching like a taut wire ready to snap, and Evelyn forced herself to look up through the curtain of her wine-dampened hair. She needed to apologize, to somehow make this right, though she had no idea how anyone could repair this level of humiliation. The sacred carpet was ruined, the ceremony disrupted, and her reputation destroyed beyond redemption. She would spend the rest of her life as the she-wolf who had made a mockery of their most revered tradition. The cautionary tale parents would tell their daughters about the importance of grace and preparation. But as her eyes lifted, something unexpected happened. Instead of finding anger or disgust in the Alpha's expression, she saw something else entirely. His golden gaze held an intensity that made her breath catch. But there was no condemnation there, no contempt for her failure. Instead, there was something that looked almost like recognition, as if he were seeing something in her that she couldn't see in herself. The sensation was overwhelming, like being examined by someone who could read the secrets written on her soul. Slowly, deliberately, Alpha Darius began to descend from his platform. The crowd parted before him automatically, their whispers dying away as he moved with fluid grace toward the spot where Evelyn knelt in her pool of shame and spilled wine. Each step echoed through the hall with ceremonial weight, and she found herself unable to look away from his approaching figure. There was something almost predatory in the way he moved, but it wasn't the threat of violence that made her pulse quicken. It was something far more dangerous and infinitely more compelling. When he reached her, he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he extended one strong hand toward her, palm up, in a gesture that was unmistakably offering assistance. The simple act sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd, because Alpha Darius Blackthorn did not help fallen she-wolves. He commanded, he led, he made decisions that affected hundreds of lives, but he did not personally involve himself in individual moments of weakness or failure. Yet here he was, offering his hand to the most unlikely candidate in the room, the one who had just proven herself spectacularly unworthy of his attention. Evelyn stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a serpent that might strike. Accepting his help would mean touching the Alpha Supreme, something that was usually reserved for high-ranking pack members and those granted specific permission. It would mean allowing him to lift her from her disgrace, but it would also mean admitting that she needed his assistance, that she was weak and dependent. The internal conflict raged through her as seconds ticked by, the entire hall holding its breath while she struggled with the decision. Her logical mind screamed warnings about presumption and impropriety, reminding her of every rule and protocol she had studied in the ancient texts. But something deeper, something she had never acknowledged before, responded to the steady patience in his golden eyes. He wasn't looking at her with pity or condescension. He was looking at her as if she were worth helping, as if her mortification hadn't diminished her value in his estimation. It was the first time in her life that someone had looked at her that way, and the sensation was both terrifying and intoxicating. Finally, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. The contact was electric, sending jolts of awareness racing up her arm and straight to her heart. His hand was warm and calloused from training and combat, completely engulfing her smaller fingers with gentle but unmistakable strength. When he pulled her to her feet, the motion was smooth and effortless, as if she weighed nothing at all. For a moment they stood close enough that she could catch his scent, pine and leather, and something indefinably masculine that made her head spin with unexpected longing. But the real shock came when he didn't immediately release her hand. Instead, Alpha Darius turned to face the assembled crowd, his voice carrying clearly through the hall as he spoke words that would change everything. "I have made my choice," he announced, his tone leaving no room for question or debate. "Evelyn Sinclair will be my Luna." The silence that followed was different from the previous quiet. This was the silence of absolute astonishment, of a reality that had just shifted so dramatically that no one knew how to respond. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face as the implications of his words crashed over her like a tide of impossibility. This couldn't be happening. Alpha Supremes chose their Lunas from among the most accomplished and socially prominent she-wolves in the pack. They chose females who'd been groomed for leadership, who understood the intricacies of pack politics and diplomatic protocol. They did not choose clumsy archivists who destroyed sacred ceremonies and tripped over their own feet. They did not choose quiet, unremarkable she-wolves who preferred books to social gatherings and spent their days cataloguing genealogies that most wolves considered boring historical trivia. Yet here she was, still holding the Alpha's hand while he declared to their entire pack that she would stand beside him as Luna, as the female leader of their community, as his partner in all the responsibilities that came with guiding their people. The crowd erupted into chaos. Voices rose in shocked exclamations and heated discussions as pack members struggled to process what they had just witnessed. Some sounded outraged, others merely confused, but all were stunned by the unprecedented nature of the Alpha's choice. Evelyn caught fragments of heated conversations, whispers about protocol and tradition, questions about her bloodline and qualifications, speculation about what could have possibly motivated such an unexpected decision. Through it all, Alpha Darius remained perfectly calm, his hands still clasping hers as if anchoring her to this impossible new reality. When she looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, he leaned down slightly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear over the tumult around them. "Trust me," he said simply, and there was something in those two words that reached past her panic and fear to touch something deeper, something that had been waiting her entire life to hear those exact syllables spoken with such quiet conviction. But trusting him would mean accepting that her life had just been turned completely upside down. It would mean acknowledging that she was no longer invisible, no longer safe in her corner of the archives where she could observe without being observed. It would mean stepping into a role she had never prepared for, taking on responsibilities she had never imagined, and facing scrutiny from every member of their pack who would now judge her worthiness to stand beside their Alpha. As the reality of her new position began to settle over her, like a weight she wasn't sure she could bear, Evelyn realized that her humiliating fall had indeed been the beginning of something transformative. But whether that transformation would lead to triumph or disaster remained to be seen, and the first whispers of doubt and resistance from the crowd suggested that her greatest challenges were yet to come. The sacred carpet beneath her feet, still stained with wine from her graceless entrance, seemed to pulse with the promise that nothing would ever be the same again. And in the depths of her racing heart, despite her terror and confusion, something small and fierce began to kindle. Perhaps she wasn't what anyone had expected in a Luna, but she was what their Alpha had chosen. Now she would have to discover whether that choice would prove to be inspired wisdom or catastrophic error, and the answer would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone she had inadvertently sworn to protect and lead. The weeks following the ceremony passed in a blur of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever Evelyn entered a room, sideways glances that felt like physical touches, and a suffocating awareness that her every move was being scrutinized by hundreds of pack members who still couldn't understand their Alpha's choice. She had moved from her modest quarters near the archives to the lunar wing of the pack house, a suite of rooms so luxurious and spacious that she felt lost among the fine furnishings and elaborate tapestries that depicted centuries of pack history. Every morning, she woke to the sound of servants bustling about, preparing clothes she had never learned to wear properly and meals she was too nervous to eat. The formal gowns hung in her closet like silent accusations, reminding her daily that she was trying to fill a role meant for someone far more sophisticated and socially adept. The jewelry box on her vanity contained pieces that had belonged to Lunas before her, each necklace and bracelet carrying the weight of tradition and expectation that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. But it was in the archives that she found her anchor, returning each day to the familiar comfort of ancient texts and historical records that didn't judge her worthiness or question her qualifications. The leather-bound volumes welcomed her back without reservation, their pages filled with stories of wolves who had lived and died long before her current crisis of identity. It was among these dusty tomes that she began to notice patterns she had never seen before, inconsistencies in the genealogical records that nagged at her methodical mind like thorns she couldn't quite extract. The pack's bloodline documentation was supposed to be flawless, maintained with religious precision for over 3 centuries. Each family's ancestry was traced back to the original founders, their pure wolf heritage documented and verified through multiple sources. But as Evelyn cross-referenced marriage records with birth certificates and territorial agreements with family claims, she discovered discrepancies that should never have existed in such carefully maintained records. Names appeared and disappeared without explanation. Dates didn't align properly between different documents. Most disturbing of all, several of the most prominent families in their pack appeared to have gaps in their lineage that had been carefully concealed with forged entries and altered documentation. The implications were staggering, because their entire social hierarchy was built upon the foundation of bloodline purity and ancestral heritage. Late one evening, as she worked alone in the archives by lamplight, a particular passage in an ancient journal caught her attention. The entry was written in the flowing script of a Luna from nearly 2 centuries ago, describing strange dreams and visions that had begun shortly after her own unexpected selection. The similarities to Evelyn's recent experiences were impossible to ignore. She too had been dreaming of wolves with silver eyes, running through forests that existed nowhere in their territory, chasing shadows that seemed to carry messages she couldn't quite decipher. But what made her blood run cold was the final entry in that long-dead Luna's journal. The writing was shaky, desperate, as if penned in great haste or fear. They have discovered the truth about the bloodlines. The council will not allow the prophecy to be fulfilled. I fear for what they will do to preserve their secrets. If something happens to me, let it be known that the silver-eyed wolves are not myth. They are memory, and they are returning. The journal ended there with no further entries from that Luna. According to the official records, she had died in a hunting accident just 3 days after writing those words. But now, holding the physical evidence of her desperation, Evelyn began to suspect that the accident had been anything but accidental. Her hands trembling, she began pulling more historical documents from the restricted sections, volumes that required special permission to access. What she found made her question everything she thought she knew about her pack's history. The prophecy mentioned in the Luna's journal appeared in fragments across multiple sources, always incomplete, always carefully edited to remove crucial details. But piecing together the fragments like a complex puzzle, Evelyn began to see a pattern emerging. The prophecy spoke of a Luna who would arise during a time of deception, chosen not for her bloodline, but for her ability to see truth where others saw only comfortable lies. This Luna would possess the sight of silver eyes, not literally but metaphorically, able to perceive the silver threads that connected past to present and revealed the hidden corruption that threatened to destroy the pack from within. As she read deeper into the night, Evelyn discovered references to her own family names scattered throughout the oldest records. The Sinclair line appeared repeatedly in connection with previous Lunars who had possessed unusual gifts, the ability to heal with touch, to sense deception in others, to communicate with wolves across great distances without shifting form. But in more recent decades, these references had been systematically removed or altered, as if someone had been deliberately erasing the Sinclair legacy from pack history. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just an unlikely choice for Luna, she was a deliberately hidden one. Her family's connection to the role had been concealed so thoroughly that even she had been unaware of her heritage. The modest cottage where she had grown up, the quiet parents who had raised her to value scholarship over social climbing, the way she had been steered toward the archives rather than more visible positions within the pack. It all suddenly made terrible sense. Someone had been preparing her for this role while simultaneously ensuring she remained invisible until the right moment. But who? And why had they chosen to reveal their plan now, through Alpha Darius's shocking selection? A soft sound from the archive's entrance made her freeze, her enhanced hearing picking up footsteps that were trying too hard to be silent. Fear shot through her as she realized how vulnerable she was, alone in the depths of the library, with documents that could potentially destabilize their entire social structure. The footsteps drew closer, moving between the tall shelves with purpose. As if the intruder knew exactly where to find her, she quickly closed the journals and slipped them into her bag, her heart hammering as she tried to appear casual despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The footsteps stopped just outside her circle of lamplight, and she could sense someone watching her from the shadows. When she finally looked up, she was surprised to find Alpha Darius emerging from between the shelves, his golden eyes unreadable in the flickering light. "You're here late," he observed, his deep voice carrying an undertone she couldn't identify. There was something different about him in the archives, away from the formal atmosphere of the pack house and the constant scrutiny of advisors and petitioners. Here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of their people, he seemed less like an untouchable leader and more like a man carrying burdens that were too heavy to bear alone. "I find it peaceful here," she replied carefully, unsure how much she should reveal about her recent discoveries. The documents in her bag felt like they were burning against her side, their secrets demanding to be shared even as her instincts warned her to proceed with caution. He moved closer, and she caught his scent again. Pine and leather and that indefinable masculinity that made her pulse quicken despite her nervousness. When he reached for one of the books she'd been reading, she tensed, but he simply examined the cover with interest rather than suspicion. "The Chronicles of Luna Morgana," he read aloud, and something in his tone suggested he was familiar with the text. "Interesting choice. Most wolves find the ancient histories tedious. Most wolves haven't spent years cataloging every document in these archives," Evelyn replied, then immediately wondered if she sounded defensive. "I find patterns in the old records that others miss. Connections between past and present that might be important." Something flickered in his golden eyes, a spark of what might have been approval or perhaps recognition. "And what patterns have you found, Evelyn?" The way he said her name, with quiet intensity rather than casual familiarity, made her breath catch. There was invitation in the question, as if he were offering her the opportunity to share burdens she had been carrying alone. But there was also danger in the invitation, because once she spoke certain truths aloud, there would be no taking them back. "I've found that our history isn't as straightforward as we've been taught," she said finally, choosing her words with care. "Some of our most fundamental beliefs about bloodlines and hierarchy appear to be based on incomplete information." Instead of anger or dismissal, she saw something that looked like relief cross his features. "You see it too," he said quietly, and it wasn't a question. "I wondered if you would, given enough time with the records." The admission stunned her. You knew there were problems with the genealogies." "I've suspected for years," he replied, settling into the chair across from her desk as if he belonged there, as if late-night conversations in the archives were perfectly natural for an Alpha Supreme. But suspecting and proving are very different things. I needed someone with the skills to uncover the truth and the integrity to handle it appropriately. "Is that why you chose me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, carrying all the vulnerability and confusion she had been hiding since the ceremony. "Not because you saw something special in me, but because you needed an archivist who could expose corruption." The silence that followed her question stretched between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something he had never told anyone else. "I chose you because you are exactly what this pack needs, even though they don't realize it yet," he said, his golden eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. "You see truth where others see only what they want to believe. You question traditions that have become so comfortable that no one remembers why they started. And you have the strength to bear the burden of knowledge that would crush someone with less integrity." His words sent warmth flooding through her chest, but also terror. If he was right, if she truly had been chosen for her ability to uncover dangerous truths, then her role as Luna would be far more complicated than she had imagined. It wouldn't be enough to simply learn proper etiquette and protocol. She would be expected to challenge the very foundations their society was built upon, and that kind of change never came without a price. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something about my own family's connection to previous Lunas. The Sinclair name appears in records going back centuries, always linked to females who possessed unusual abilities. But those references have been systematically removed from recent documentation." This time, his reaction was sharp and immediate. He leaned forward, his entire attention focused on her words with predatory intensity. "Show me," he commanded, and there was nothing of the gentleman who had helped her to her feet in his tone. This was the Alpha Supreme, and he would not be denied. With trembling hands, Evelyn pulled out the journals and documents she had discovered, spreading them across the desk between them. As Alpha Darius examined the evidence, she watched his expression grow darker with each page he turned. The controlled anger radiating from him was palpable, filling the small space between the shelves with tension that made her skin prickle with awareness. "This goes deeper than I suspected," he murmured, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made her glad she was on his side rather than opposing him. "Someone has been manipulating our history for decades, possibly longer. The question is, who has the access and authority to make changes this extensive without detection? The answer to that question would implicate some of the most powerful wolves in their pack, individuals who sat on the Council of Elders and influenced decisions that affected hundreds of lives. The political ramifications would be enormous, potentially tearing apart alliances and friendships that had endured for generations." But as she looked at the evidence spread before them, Evelyn realized they had passed the point of no return. The truth was too important to hide, regardless of the consequences. And sitting across from her, studying the falsified documents with grim determination, was an Alpha who had chosen her precisely because she would never back down from a fight that needed to be fought. The real question now was whether they would survive the battle that was coming, and whether their pack would emerge stronger or shattered when all the secrets finally came to light. The council meeting that would change everything was called for the night of the full moon, when pack bonds were strongest and deception was supposed to be impossible under the ancient laws that governed their kind. Evelyn stood at the massive oak doors of the council chamber, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to reveal. The evidence they had gathered over the past month filled 2 leather satchels, each document a thread in a web of corruption that reached back generations. Alpha Darius stood beside her, his presence both comforting and electrifying. In the weeks since their late-night discovery in the archives, their relationship had deepened beyond the formal bonds of Alpha and Luna. He had begun seeking her counsel on matters both large and small, valuing her insight in ways that made her heart race, with possibilities she barely dared acknowledge. But tonight, their personal connection would be tested by the political firestorm they were about to unleash. The council chamber was already filled when they entered. 13 of the pack's most powerful wolves seated around the ancient circular table carved from a single massive tree that had stood in their territory for over 1,000 years. Elder Matthias Cromwell sat at the head, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight, his pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence and something else, something that made Evelyn's newly awakened instincts whisper warnings. To his right sat Elder Victoria Sterling, whose daughter had been expected to claim the Luna position until Darius's shocking choice. The woman's expression was carefully neutral, but Evelyn could scent the hostility radiating from her like smoke. As they took their seats, Evelyn noticed how the other council members avoided direct eye contact with her. Some shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, while others whispered among themselves in voices too low for normal hearing to detect. But Evelyn's senses had been growing stronger each day since accepting her role as Luna, and she caught fragments of their conversations, questions about her qualifications, speculation about blackmail or coercion, doubt about the Alpha's judgment. Elder Cromwell called the meeting to order with traditional formality, but Evelyn detected an undercurrent of tension in his voice that suggested he knew this would not be an ordinary session. Alpha Darius has requested this emergency council to discuss matters of historical significance, he announced, his gaze flickering between the Alpha and Luna with barely concealed suspicion. The floor is yours. Darius rose slowly, his commanding presence filling the chamber as he began to speak. His voice carried the authority of absolute leadership, but also the weight of someone about to shatter comfortable illusions. Honored elders, what I am about to share will challenge everything we have believed about our pack's history and the legitimacy of our current social structure. Luna Evelyn has uncovered evidence of systematic falsification in our genealogical records, spanning multiple generations and affecting several of our most prominent families. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Voices rose in outrage and denial. Chairs scraped against stone as several elders leaped to their feet, and the scent of fear and anger filled the chamber like a toxic cloud. Elder Sterling's face had gone white with rage, while Elder Cromwell's expression shifted from surprise to something far more dangerous. "This is preposterous," Elder Sterling snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Are you seriously suggesting that our most sacred traditions are based on lies? That the bloodlines we have preserved for centuries are somehow fraudulent?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Evelyn replied, her voice steady despite the hostility directed toward her. She began removing documents from the leather satchels, laying them out on the table with methodical precision. "I'm presenting proof." The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Marriage certificates that had been altered to hide mixed bloodlines, birth records that didn't match the official genealogies, territorial agreements that revealed how certain families had gained their positions through deception rather than inheritance. Most shocking of all were the records showing how references to the Sinclair line and other families with supernatural gifts had been systematically erased from official documentation. As the council members examined the documents, their reactions revealed more than Evelyn had expected. Some appeared genuinely shocked, their surprise seemingly authentic as they struggled to process the implications. But others, particularly the eldest members who would have been in positions to authorize such extensive changes, showed responses that suggested they were not learning this information for the first time. Elder Cromwell's hands shook as he held one of the falsified genealogies, but his tremor seemed more from anger at being exposed than shock at the revelation. "Even if these documents are authentic," he said carefully. You cannot prove when these alterations were made, or who authorized them. This could be the work of a single rogue archivist generations ago. Actually, we can prove exactly when and how these changes were made, Evelyn replied, producing another set of documents. Cross-referencing the paper composition, ink analysis, and writing styles, we can trace most of these falsifications to a specific 20-year period, beginning approximately 40 years ago. The alterations were made by multiple hands, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than individual deception. The silence that followed was suffocating. 40 years ago would implicate several of the current council members, including Elder Cromwell himself, who had been in charge of historical preservation during that exact period. The mathematical precision of the timeline left no room for coincidental explanations or plausible denial, but it was Elder Victoria Sterling who provided the final piece of evidence they needed. Her composure finally cracking under the weight of exposure, she stood abruptly and pointed an accusing finger directly at Evelyn. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she snarled, her carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbling away. "Digging through old papers, finding patterns that should have stayed buried, you have no idea what you've done, what forces you've awakened." Her words were a confession, and everyone in the chamber knew it. But more than that, they carried a threat that made Evelyn's blood run cold. This wasn't just about historical accuracy or social hierarchy. There were deeper secrets at stake, dangers that went beyond political embarrassment or loss of social standing. Alpha Darius's response was swift and decisive. His power filled the chamber like a physical presence, pressing down on everyone present with the undeniable authority of his position. "Elder Sterling, you will explain exactly what you mean by that statement, and you will do so truthfully, because I can scent deception, and my patience for games ended the moment you threatened my Luna." The possessive way he said "my Luna" sent heat racing through Evelyn's chest, but she forced herself to focus on Sterling's increasingly desperate expression. The woman looked around the chamber as if seeking allies, but found only faces carefully averted in the universal body language of wolves abandoning a packmate who had revealed weakness. "The bloodlines were altered to protect the pack," Sterling said finally, her voice breaking. "There were prophecies, old warnings about what would happen if certain bloodlines were allowed to produce lunas. We thought we were preventing disaster, not creating it." "What prophecies?" Darius demanded, his golden eyes blazing with authority that would not be denied. Elder Cromwell answered instead, his voice heavy with decades of carefully guarded secrets. "The prophecy of Silver Sight. It spoke of a Luna who would arise during a time of hidden corruption, chosen not for her bloodline, but for her ability to see truth. This Luna would possess gifts that had been dormant for generations, and her emergence would herald either the pack's salvation or its complete destruction." Evelyn felt the world tilt around her as pieces of a cosmic puzzle suddenly clicked into place. The dreams she had been having, the growing strength of her supernatural senses, the way she could detect deception in others with increasing accuracy, it all pointed to abilities she was only beginning to understand. "You've been trying to prevent the prophecy," she whispered, the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear, "by hiding the bloodlines that could produce a Luna with Silver Sight, by steering potential candidates away from positions of influence, by ensuring that only politically safe choices were available when alphas needed to select their mates." "It was necessary," Cromwell insisted, but his conviction was wavering. "The prophecy warned that such a Luna would tear apart the existing order, would challenge every tradition and hierarchy we have built. We believed we were protecting our people from chaos. Instead, you created the corruption that made the prophecy necessary in the first place," Darius replied, his voice cutting with cold logic. "Your attempts to prevent change created the stagnation and deception that now threatens everything we are." The revelation hung in the air between them like a blade waiting to fall. But before anyone could respond, The chamber doors burst open with explosive force. A young wolf stumbled into the room, his eyes wild with panic and his clothes torn from a desperate run through the forest. "Alpha," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The Ravencrest pack has crossed our borders." They're moving toward the main settlement with a force large enough to challenge our entire territory. They claim they're acting on intelligence about internal corruption that has weakened our defenses. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had leaked information about their internal strife to their enemies, providing the Ravencrest pack with the perfect opportunity to strike while they were divided and vulnerable. Evelyn's mind raced as she considered the implications. Their neighboring pack had been looking for an excuse to expand their territory for years, and news of political instability would be exactly the opening they needed. But as she looked around the council chamber at the faces of wolves who had spent decades guarding secrets and manipulating truth, she realized they were facing something far more complex than simple territorial aggression. The Ravencrest pack's intelligence was too detailed, their timing too precise. Someone within their own pack had been feeding information to their enemies, and that someone was likely sitting at this very table. Alpha Darius was already moving, his leadership instincts taking over despite the chaos of revelations and accusations surrounding them. "Council members will remain here under guard while we deal with this threat," he commanded, his authority brooking no argument. "No one leaves this chamber until we determine who has been collaborating with our enemies." But Evelyn's attention was caught by something else, a detail that sent ice racing through her veins. Elder Sterling was no longer looking panicked or defensive. Instead, her expression had shifted to something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if the arrival of enemy forces was not the disaster it appeared to be, but rather the culmination of a plan that was finally bearing fruit. The pieces of the puzzle rearranged themselves in her mind with terrifying clarity. The systematic erasure of certain bloodlines, the efforts to prevent the prophecy, the perfectly timed enemy attack, it all pointed to a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple political maneuvering. Someone had been working to destroy their pack from within, weakening them through internal corruption, while simultaneously providing their enemies with the information needed to strike at the perfect moment. And a silver light began to emanate from her eyes, reflecting an ancient power that had finally awakened. Evelyn realized that she was not just witnessing the fulfillment of prophecy, but actively becoming the instrument of either salvation or destruction that the ancients had foretold. The choice of which outcome would prevail now rested in her hands, and the decision she made in the next few minutes would determine the fate of everyone she had sworn to protect. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since that humiliating night when she had fallen on the sacred carpet, Evelyn Sinclair felt truly ready to claim her destiny as the Luna no one had expected, but everyone desperately needed.